Welcome to RealScary, the home of true scary stories, where we bring you the most unnerving of content, from British ghost stories to the most gruesome of murders. So if you're quite partial to a scary story, you're in the right place. In 1956, Shirley Hitchings was a typical 15-year-old teenager. That was until one winter evening in mid-October, when an unknown phenomena began scrawling messages on her bedroom walls, starting fires in the house where she lived, throwing her out of bed, and even levitating her. This is the story of the Battersea Poltergeist. It all started with a small, single, silver key, which appeared one morning in the centre of the pillow belonging to the 15-year-old Shirley. Shirley was understandably puzzled as to where the key had come from, and after asking, no one in her family at the Terrace Victorian house in Battersea, southwest London, had ever seen it before. And upon checking, it did not fit any of the locks. But that night in October 1956, as the suburban street fell quietly to sleep, the knocking began. Remarkably loud banging that reverberated around the entirety of the house. Claw-like scratching could be heard from the internals of the furniture. The lights would randomly flash on and off. The commotion was so loud that the neighbours came round to voice their complaints. It was as if the noise was coming from the bowels of the house, recalled Shirley, and it went on until daylight. We were very traumatised. I remember clinging to my father, saying, "Please make it stop, please make it stop." Unfortunately for the Hitchings family, this was merely the beginning. The key that Shirley found at the centre of her pillow vanished as quickly as it had appeared, never to be seen again. The terrifying noises, however, did indeed return, and they did so night after night after night. And what was to follow over the next 12 years has become one of the most terrifying and chilling paranormal encounters in British history. The terrifying and unnerving story quickly caught the public's attention, becoming a national news story, and one that was even discussed in the Houses of Parliament. Shirley lived at 63 Wycliffe Road in Battersea with her mum, Kitty, and father, Wally, who was a London Underground train driver. Also residing in the house was Shirley's Irish grandmother Ethel and her adopted brother John, who was a surveyor and in his early 20s. Recalling the first night in 1956, Shirley says the whole house shook like there was an air raid taking place, and it went night after night for 3 solid weeks. We were all shattered and deprived of sleep. The Hitchings family called the police and various surveyors to try to get to the root cause of where the noises were coming from. However, everything and everyone drew a blank. The noises could not be explained. After 3 weeks, events took a more sinister turn, when various objects started moving on their own accord. On one occasion, Shirley's glove flew from the floor and hit Wally, her father, in the face. Cutlery and heavy pots and pans were chucked from the kitchen, even though there was no one in the kitchen at the time. They would float towards you and then suddenly speed up, forcing you to duck to avoid being hit, recalled Shirley. Or they would simply hover and then smash into the wall. On one occasion, the family watched, amazed and terrified at the same time, as slippers would walk around the room on their own. The piano would suddenly play its own tune. It was all remarkably unnerving. Things came to a sudden head one awful night when Shirley was awoken by her bedsheets being dragged off her. Her family, woken by Shirley's screams of terror, rushed into Shirley's bedroom and tried to put her sheets back on. However, they found themselves in the middle of a tug-of-war battle with what can only be described as a very strong, invisible force pulling in the opposite direction. What the Hitchings family saw next was the most unnerving and terrifying event to date. Shirley suddenly went rigid, her back arched, and rose several inches from her bed. Shirley recounts, "I remember the sheets coming off and being tossed about in the bed, and then all of a sudden I was floating above the bed." Shirley's grandma, who was Catholic, was convinced Shirley had been possessed by the devil, and Shirley herself thought she was going mad. It was breathtakingly traumatizing, she recounts. In February, the story reached the national press and the family were besieged with offers to investigate. However, one positive did come from all the media attention, and that was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Harold Chibbett, who was also known as Chib. He was a ghost hunter and devoted the rest of his life to the Battersea Poltergeist case. It was Chib who told the Hitchings family they were dealing with poltergeist activity, and although somewhat rare, this type of spirit is responsible for physical disturbances such as the throwing of objects and making loud noises. But as both evidence shows and Chib explained, there is almost always a teenage girl at the centre of their activity. Shirley recalls, "Upon hearing this, I was horrified. I had never even heard of the word poltergeist before. My level of fear had now reached epidemic proportions. I believed this was the end. We were all going to die." Taking matters into their own hands, the Hitchings family arranged for Shirley to be exorcised at the home of Mr. Harry Hanks, who was a part-time medium and who also worked with Shirley's father, Wally. However, before the exorcism could begin, the police arrived at Harry's house, having been tipped off about alleged occultism and witchcraft taking place there. This in turn led to the haunting at 63 Wycliffe Road in Battersea being raised in the House of Commons by the then Home Secretary Gwilym Lloyd George. Chib suggested that the family should try to make contact with the poltergeist. He brought letter cards and laid them on the table. The idea was that Chib would point to the letters and the spirit would tap to indicate when the right letters were reached to spell out words. Slowly the spirit did begin to tap out messages and claimed to be a Frenchman, and also that he was very scared. Shirley recalls, "It didn't make us feel sorry for him, we just wanted him to go away." The poltergeist, however, was not deterred. Shortly after the message "Viva France" was scribed on the wall, Chib decided to leave paper and pen in the family's front room, which was the only room in the house with a lock, and Chib took the only key home with him. The aforementioned room came to be known as Donald's room, which is the name Shirley's mother had given the ghost. And in his room, he would tap along to the music on the television and arrange dolls in the most bizarre circle. In the morning, after Chib arrived, he would unlock the door to Donald's room, and there would be 60 to 70 notes found inside. and there is said to be thousands of these notes in Chib's files. One of the notes simply read chillingly, "Shirley, I come." Many more are unreadable or a bizarre mixture of French and English, sometimes addressed to Mon chéri Chibette. Events took a more eerie turn when Donald claimed to be the lost Dauphin Louis Charles, heir to the throne of France. The fate of 10-year-old son of Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution has been subject to 200 years of speculation. The letters from Donald contained facts few would have known, such as the name of Louis the Child's bodyguards, later verified in Parisian archives by Chib. For Shirley, the worst period was March 1956. A couple of months after the haunting began, Donald started making demands. He wanted me to wear my hair a certain way, and he would threaten me if I never adhered to his demands, he would set fires in the house. Shirley's father decided to lock all the knives in the air raid shelter. However, his efforts were futile, as fires would still start all over the house. One night, Shirley's father got quite badly burnt putting out a fire that Donald had started, and underneath the burn, there was unexplained and visible claw marks. Shirley's grandmother Ethel was perhaps the one who suffered the most. Donald would try to push her down the stairs, Shirley says. And one night in October, objects started to float around the room filled with whispering. Then came a voice. The voice was of an Irish woman. Ethel was gobsmacked. She immediately identified the voice of that as her late mother. Sadly, it was all too much for poor Ethel, and she had a stroke a few days later and subsequently died. As strange as it sounds, the family became used to the phenomena and the episodes became somewhat less intense, as if Donald fed off their fear. But horrifically, events were not just confined to the house. Shirley was sacked from her part-time job as a seamstress in Selfridges when scissors started to disappear, and she was forced to admit to management she was the poltergeist girl. In 1964, the family moved to Latchmere Road, also in Battersea, a 15-minute walk away, but still the activity continued. Shirley recalls the whole situation ruined my life. It took my teenage years. I was 21 before I could get anything near normality, and even then, Donald, interfered in my life. One boyfriend came to the house and was trying to goad Donald by saying things like, "Come on, Donald, do your worst." But the young man fled after a ball was tipped onto his head. Once, when Shirley went out in the car with a man who would become her husband later in time, she came home to find her mother sitting with written messages from Donald saying what they had been up to together. The last message from Donald came in 1968. Shirley was living in West Sussex with her husband and young son, and Donald was in the habit of leaving messages on Shirley's notepad that she kept beside the telephone. This letter informed her of what her parents were doing back in London. Was it extremely weird? Yes, it was. But for Shirley, this was normal. The final note from Donald said he was leaving, and from that day onwards, Shirley never heard from him, ever again. Shirley recalls her mother went into a kind of mourning. She'd got to think of Donald as kind of like a son. But both Shirley and Wally, Shirley's father, were both extremely delighted. the tale doesn't completely end there. In the 1980s, a medium randomly approached Shirley at a craft fair she was attending and told Shirley, who she did not know, that she was being followed by a little boy in a blue satin fancy dress who has long red hair. It's a description Shirley recognised all too well. Chib had once given her a postcard featuring Louis Charles wearing a blue satin suit with red hair, and recently at a psychic evening with her daughter, Shirley was giving a message from a boy who said he was sorry for all he had done. The house that brought so much misery to the Hitchings family was demolished by the council in the 1960s. But you can't help wonder when Donald will next choose to occupy someone else's home. Thank you for joining me in our latest edition in Scary Stories. I hope that you enjoyed. And if you did enjoy, I would ask that you like, share and subscribe. And as always, be safe and sweet dreams.